Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about the imaginary numbers and how to work with them. And imaginary numbers are obtained by having a negative underneath the square root. Okay, so when we talk about an imaginary unit right here, we call it the letter I. And I is going to equal the square root of -1. And then so I squared is going to equal -1. And then we'll talk about how to manipulate something underneath the square root. It's very easy to work with, and basically it is the idea that if we have some square root of a negative number, so if we look down here, how do we come up with our imaginary values? Some square root of a negative number where r is a real number, or I shouldn't say that, r is greater than 0, then what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and we're going to look at it in one way. We're going to look at the initial definition of I is equal to the square root of -1. Based on our properties of multiplying roots, we know that this is the same as the square root of r times the square root of -1. Well, I know the square root of -1 is I, and then I have r left over. And what this allows me to work with now is what's underneath the square root is positive, and I have this imaginary value, or I, out in front. So let's use this real number, -10, to work with the example. So -10, or the square root of -10, is the same as the -1 square root times +10. We know that this guy is equal to I, and then I write it as √10. So real quick, just another example, and then we'll work with some perfect squares, and then we'll talk a little bit more about I squared and what happens there. But if we look at the square root of -7, well, the trick is, rather than writing all these steps, well, it's negative, so I'm going to write an I out front and call it a positive underneath the square root. That's how I work with it. Now, if I have something that's a perfect square, or something that can be reduced or simplified, so let's take the square root of -4, for example. Well, the square root of -4 is 2. Well, I'm just going to follow this process and put the I out in front and make it positive. And then, what's the square root of 4? It's 2. And the way it's written, I would have I2, but we want to write I behind the actual value. So I is always written last, and so just get accustomed to doing that. So let's say I had the square root of -8. Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write I in front of the root. So if we add a root, I is in front. If we have a whole number, it's in the back. Well, I know 8 is the same as 4 times 2, so I know that the square root of 4 is 2. So I'm going to reduce this to 2√2. Well, I got an I also, so putting this all together, I have 2I √2. Okay? Let's do an example, or a couple more. So if I had the square root of -16, well, I know that the square root of 16 is 4. Because it's negative, I'm going to have this I. So I would call that 4I. And I'm not doing any work, I'm just talking you through the problem. How about the square root of 27, -27? Okay, so I know that -27 is 9 times 3, right? We know the square root of 9 is 3, so I know I'm going to have this I. Okay, so we take one of these 3's out. So I know because of the negative, I'm going to pull an I out, and then I have a 3 left over. Notice the difference between these two guys. I get a number that simplifies without a radical, so the I is written behind the number. Any number, and notice we have that same pattern here, but the radical is always listed last. This is just formatting, so just make sure that you get comfortable with this as you take future classes. This is how your teacher is going to want you to format imaginary or complex values. In the next couple of videos, we'll deal with working with imaginary values and talking about different ways to look at the imaginary unit.